There's a point in life when curiosity turns into something darker, into something dangerous. It's the moment when your instincts are screaming at you to stop, to walk away, but you don't. I learned that the hard way. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. I had been hired by an older couple to do some simple repairs around their house. They were nice enough, polite, soft-spoken, but a little odd. They'd found me through a flyer I'd left at the local hardware store offering my handyman services. The house itself was large, old, and tucked away in the quieter outskirts of town. It had that old-world charm with creaking floorboards and an architecture that spoke of a time long past. The kind of place that you could tell had stories, maybe even secrets. When I first arrived, I got the tour. It was the usual rundown. Fix a leaky pipe in the bathroom, rehang a couple of loose doors, and check out a wiring issue in the attic. Easy money, really. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Howaren, kept to themselves for the most part, leaving me to work while they went about their day. They were friendly enough, but had this odd way of drifting off during conversations, like they were distracted by something they didn't want to talk about. It wasn't until my second day there that I noticed the basement. I had just finished repairing a window in one of the bedrooms and was heading downstairs when I passed a door that hadn't been on the initial tour. It was tucked into the corner of a narrow hallway, partially obscured by a coat rack. The door itself was old, its wood darkened with age, and there was something about it that drew my attention. It was locked. Now, I'm not one to pry. I've done enough odd jobs in people's homes to know that some doors are meant to stay closed. Everyone's entitled to their privacy. But something about that door gnawed at me. Maybe it was the way the lock seemed out of place. New, shiny, contrasting sharply with the rest of the house's aging aesthetic. Or maybe it was just my own curiosity getting the better of me. I didn't ask about it right away. I continued with my work, but the thought of that locked door lingered in my mind, growing heavier with each passing hour. What were they keeping down there? Why hadn't they mentioned the basement? On the third day, I finally worked up the nerve to ask. It was early afternoon, and I was in the kitchen fixing a broken cabinet hinge when Mrs. Howaren walked in. She was carrying a tray of tea, her hands shaking slightly, though whether it was from age or something else, I couldn't tell. "How's everything coming along?" she asked, her voice light, but there was an undercurrent of something. Tension. "Maybe?" "Pretty well," I replied, setting down my screwdriver. "Most of the major repairs are done, but I noticed a door in the back hallway. Seems to lead to the basement. Do you want me to take a look down there? See if anything needs fixing?" For a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. It was gone just as quickly, replaced by a tight, forced smile. "Oh no, that's not necessary," she said quickly. "The basement's fine. We don't use it much these days." Her answer felt rehearsed, too smooth. It made me even more suspicious. "Are you sure?" I pressed, trying to sound casual. I could check for mold, leaks, anything like that. Sometimes these old houses... "No," she interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. She caught herself, blinking rapidly as though surprised by her own outburst. Then, in a softer tone, she added, "Really, it's not necessary. There's nothing down there." But the way she said it, TB. The exact phrasing set off alarm bells in my head. "There's nothing down there. People don't lock up nothing." I let it go, at least on the surface. I finished up my work for the day, but that door kept pulling at my thoughts, its presence nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. And that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I was going to get into that basement. The next morning, I arrived at the house early. Mr. and Mrs. Howaren were in the living room watching TV, barely acknowledging my presence as I grabbed my tools and headed upstairs to work on the final task. A faulty light fixture in one of the guest rooms. The job didn't take long, and by mid-morning, I was back downstairs, alone, in the hallway with the locked door. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should leave it alone, but something inside me, curiosity, stupidity, I don't know, told me I had to see what was behind that door. I needed to know. I tried the doorknob just to confirm what I already knew. It was locked. I checked the edges of the door frame, looking for any weaknesses, but it was solid. That's when I remembered the lockpicking kit I kept in my tool bag. I had bought it years ago out of fascination, never thinking I'd actually need to use it, but now it seemed like the perfect solution. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, I pulled the small kit from my bag and knelt in front of the door. My hands were shaking slightly as I slid the picks into the lock, working slowly, carefully. It took longer than I expected. This was a newer, sturdier lock than I was used to, but after a few minutes of tense concentration, I heard the soft click of the tumblers falling into place. The door was unlocked. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to turn back, to relock the door and pretend I hadn't just crossed a line. But it was too late for that now. My curiosity had taken control. I twisted the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, and a wave of cold, musty air rushed up from the darkness below. The basement was pitch black, and I could barely make out the shape of a steep wooden staircase leading down into the void. The air smelled damp, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in years. I reached into my bag and pulled out my flashlight, flicking it on as I descended the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing walls lined with crumbling stone and old wooden beams. The basement was larger than I expected. Low ceiling, cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and other random debris. As I stepped off the last stair and onto the cold concrete floor, I felt the temperature drop even further. The dampness clung to my skin, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my own breathing heavy and loud in the confined space. I swept the flashlight around the room, scanning the piles of junk, looking for anything unusual. At first, it just seemed like any other neglected basement. Old furniture covered in dust, rusted tools scattered about, stacks of moldy cardboard boxes. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the far corner of the room, I saw it. A door. It was small, almost hidden behind a large pile of boxes, but it was unmistakable. Another door. My heart rate quickened as I moved toward it, stepping over debris and shoving the boxes aside to get a better look. Unlike the other door, this one wasn't locked. The wood was warped and splintered with age, and the knob was rusted. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before turning the handle and pulling the door open. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming stench of rot, of something long dead and decaying. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my sleeve as I shone the flashlight into the small, windowless room. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was small, barely large enough to stand in, and the walls were lined with thick metal chains, each one bolted securely into the stone. The floor was stained with dark, dried patches, blood. I realized with a sickening jolt, and in the corner, huddled in the shadows, was the shape of a person. At least it had been a person once. The figure was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken and hollow. Their clothes were tattered, and their hands and feet were shackled to the walls by heavy iron cuffs. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hands as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The body was long dead, but the horror of the scene was still fresh, still raw. Whoever they were, they had been left here to die. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to process the unimaginable. I needed to get out of here. I needed to call the police, tell someone, anyone, what I had found. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint creak from the stairs behind me. My blood froze in my veins, and I slowly turned my head, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway above, was Mr. Howaren. His face was calm, expressionless, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't mean to, but before I could finish, I saw the glint of something in his hand, a hammer, and then everything went black. I woke up in darkness. My head throbbed, and I felt cold metal digging into my wrists and ankles. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The chains rattled, and then I realized where I was. I was in the small, windowless room, and I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the darkness, I heard breathing. Slow, shallow breathing. It wasn't over. It had only just begun.